She remained in a wheelchair, thinking she could trust her son, but what he did turned everything upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. When the van doors opened, the heat slapped Rebecca in the face, a humid wave that carried the scent of wet grass, distant fried food, and the metallic taste of city dust. She shifted in her wheelchair, bracing her arms on the rims to steady herself as the social worker, Miss Lane, pulled her luggage onto the cracked sidewalk in front of the aging duplex. Rebecca had always felt out of place in the world, but this was different. The narrow porch, the peeling white paint, the overgrown hedges swallowing the railing, all felt like the last place she would ever choose, yet it was the only place that would take her. Inside, the air was stuffy, a tired ceiling fan rattling as it pushed warm air in circles. An elderly neighbor peered through the cracked door across the hall, eyes darting to the sight of a dark-skinned woman in a wheelchair, her body thin but her shoulders stubbornly squared. She'd been here only minutes, and already she felt the stares, the quiet judgment of people who thought they knew her story before she opened her mouth. A welfare case, a burden, a woman with no family worth mentioning. And yet, she reminded herself, she had come here to try again, to live in dignity, even if the world offered her only scraps of it. The first days were filled with the hollow sound of her wheels over the linoleum floors, the clatter of spoons against chipped bowls as she fed herself cereal in the morning, the relentless reminders of what she could not do alone. She tried to maneuver into the tiny bathroom only to find her chair scraping the door frame, the mirror too high for her to see her face properly. It felt like the world was built to remind her of her limitations. At night, the noises of the neighborhood crept through the thin walls. Laughter, a baby's cry, a dog barking, the low hum of a television. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, whispering prayers she had memorized as a child, asking for strength to remain soft, not to let the world's weight harden her heart. She spent mornings rolling out onto the porch, inhaling the humid air, watching people move in and out of their cars, going to jobs she could no longer work, carrying bags of groceries she could not lift. She would nod politely to them, and they would nod back with awkward half-smiles, pity and distance in their eyes. It was during these mornings that she met Mary, her next-door neighbor, who would wave as she watered the plants along her porch rail. Mary was white, heavy-set, and always wore a colorful apron, her hair tied in a scarf. She brought over a slice of pie one day, introducing herself in a cheerful voice that barely hid her curiosity. They talked on the porch, Rebecca explaining that she had come from a city shelter after losing her small apartment when the benefits were cut. She did not mention the details of the eviction, the humiliation of being carried out while neighbors watched, whispering about the dark-skinned woman who could not pay her rent, about how she must have done something wrong. She did not tell Mary about the way the landlord had stood there, arms crossed, as her few belongings were tossed into bags, his smirk reminding her that her place in the world was always conditional. Mary didn't pry, just nodded and said, "You're here now. That's what matters," before excusing herself to check on the oven. That evening, Rebecca cried quietly as she ate the pie, the taste of cinnamon and apples reminding her of her grandmother's kitchen, of a time when she was a little girl running barefoot through a backyard before the accident, before the wheelchair, before the world had pressed so heavily on her shoulders. It was the third morning when she first saw Jonah, standing across the street, his head of shaggy blonde hair shining under the morning sun, a paper bag clutched to his chest. He was 15, pale and freckled, with a wary look in his blue eyes that seemed older than his age. He was living with a foster family down the block, Mary had explained later, a boy who had seen too much too young. He glanced at Rebecca, their eyes meeting for a brief, electric moment before he looked away, shuffling down the sidewalk, hugging the bag as if it contained his entire world. That afternoon, Mary explained that Jonah sometimes did odd jobs around the neighborhood for pocket money, mowing lawns, running errands, fixing creaky doors that old neighbors could not fix themselves. She suggested that Rebecca could ask him to help with the overgrown weeds choking the side of the house. Rebecca nodded but did not act immediately. She was used to doing things alone or not at all because asking for help felt like admitting weakness, a vulnerability she could not afford to show. But the weeds kept growing, curling around the steps, climbing up the siding, and she could not reach them from her chair. On a humid afternoon, after failing to pull a vine loose and nearly tipping her chair, she saw Jonah passing by again, clutching a rusty bike with a crooked handlebar. She called out, her voice hesitant, asking if he had a moment. He stopped, blinking, shifting his weight from one foot to the other before nodding. He worked quietly, pulling weeds with quick, practiced movements, occasionally glancing at her as she tried to help by pointing out the worst spots. He didn't say much, just nodded and listened, his face unreadable. She offered him water, which he accepted with a quiet thank you, his hands trembling slightly as he took the cup. She noticed the bruises on his arms, small and fading, but there, and the way he flinched when a car door slammed down the street. She didn't ask, just offered him another glass of water, her eyes meeting his, letting him know she saw him without prying. In the days that followed, Jonah began stopping by more often, sometimes to help carry groceries when Mary brought over a bag, sometimes to adjust the ramp that kept shifting on the porch steps. He never stayed long, always looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to call him back, to remind him of something he was not allowed to forget. Rebecca began to look forward to those brief visits, the quiet exchanges, the way he would sometimes smile, a small, crooked smile that made him look like the child he was supposed to be. She learned to read the way his shoulders tightened when he heard certain sounds, the way he would glance at the house down the block where his foster family lived, a small, sagging building with a broken fence and an unkempt yard. She did not know the details, but she had lived enough to understand when a child was afraid to go home. She saw the way he lingered by the gate, pretending to fix his bike, delaying his return until the streetlights flickered on. At night, she would pray for him, for the boy with the wary eyes and bruised arms, asking God to protect him, to give him strength, to give her the strength to know what to do if the day came when he needed her. She knew the world was not kind to boys like Jonah, just as it was not kind to women like her, women who had learned to endure, to smile while swallowing the bitterness of injustice, to keep going because there was no other choice. And so, the quiet days in the duplex became a fragile routine, marked by the sounds of Jonah's footsteps on the porch, by the way he would knock softly before entering, by the way he would sometimes leave small things behind, a screwdriver, a crumpled note with a list of herbs he asked her about, a piece of candy she suspected he had stolen or been given by someone who did not care to keep him fed. She saved these small tokens, placing them on a shelf by the window, reminders that even in her small world, connections could be made, hope could be nurtured, trust could grow. Yet beneath this fragile routine was the constant undercurrent of fear, the knowledge that something was wrong in Jonah's world, something he could not speak of, something that lingered in the way he avoided her eyes when she asked if he was all right. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the quick glances, the way he would sometimes stand too close to her, as if seeking comfort, yet flinching when she raised her hand to adjust her glasses. Rebecca understood that darkness did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it crept quietly, hiding in the corners of rooms, in the silences of conversations, in the way a child's eyes darted to the floor. She had seen it in her own life, in the men who had brushed against her in crowded rooms, in the landlord who had touched her shoulder for too long while she signed papers she could not read, in the social worker who had spoken kindly while ignoring her protests. She watched Jonah with the cautious hope of someone who had learned the hard way that the world could take everything from you and still demand more. She would not let the world take him, too, if she could help it. She would wait. She would watch. And when the time came, she would be ready to protect him, even if it cost her the fragile peace she had built in this small corner of the world. As summer deepened, the days grew hotter, the air thick with the promise of rain, and Rebecca found herself waiting for the sound of Jonah's footsteps, for the brief moments of connection that reminded her that even in a world that took and took, there was still room for kindness, for hope, for the quiet resistance of people who refused to give up on each other. She did not know what was coming, but she felt it in her bones, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath on those heavy afternoons, in the way Jonah's eyes sometimes filled with unshed tears before he turned away. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the path ahead would be hard, that the past she had fought to leave behind might rise again in the fight to protect the boy who had come into her life like an unexpected promise. And so, under the relentless Georgia sun, in a neighborhood that barely noticed her, Rebecca prepared herself, knowing that the story of her survival was not yet finished, that the chapters ahead would test the strength she had fought to reclaim, that she would not turn away when the moment came, because she was here now, and so was Jonah, and that was enough to begin again. Rebecca felt the soft hush of summer evenings in Savannah as a kind of watchful silence, like the city itself was holding its breath. The shadows grew longer across the cracked sidewalks, the air heavy with the scent of hot asphalt cooling and wet earth where the neighbors watered their dry lawns. In these hours, when the street lights flickered to life one by one, Jonah's silhouette often appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly, his shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight he could not put down. Their quiet routine had settled into a fragile rhythm. He would come by in the afternoons, pretending to adjust the ramp on the porch, or water the potted basil Rebecca had tried to keep alive, though the heat often won. They would talk in slow, careful exchanges, their conversation simple. How the sky looked, how the tomatoes were ripening too quickly, how the humidity made the air feel like wet cloth on the skin. But beneath every word was something unspoken, a question that neither of them was ready to form aloud. Jonah's eyes, blue and restless, often darted to the window of his foster home down the street, a sagging structure with missing shutters and a front door that seemed to tilt on its hinges. She saw the way he froze when a truck rumbled past, or how he would press himself against the porch railing when a male voice called out from that house, his breath catching so softly she would not have noticed if she had not learned to hear the smallest sounds. There was something there, in that glance, in that fear that she recognized deep within herself, a fear that once belonged to her, too. The first time she saw the bruises again, they were hidden beneath the cuff of his sleeve as he handed her a bag of groceries, insisting he could carry it up the ramp for her. His hand trembled slightly, and the fabric shifted, revealing a dark blotch along the inside of his wrist. He pulled the sleeve down quickly, offering her a smile that was too quick, too practiced, the kind of smile a child learns when they realize the world is watching, and they must hide their pain to survive. Rebecca thanked him, her voice steady, her eyes holding his for a long moment before she looked away, giving him the dignity of pretending she had not seen. But that night, when she rolled to the window to watch the moths beat themselves against the porch light, she wept quietly, pressing her palm to her lips to keep the sobs from spilling into the quiet house. She prayed for him, prayed for strength, prayed for the wisdom to know when to act and how, prayed that God would protect Jonah in ways she could not. The next day was a Sunday, the kind of day when the neighborhood seemed to slow down, the sounds of lawnmowers and children's laughter blending with the chirp of cicadas. Rebecca was on the porch when Jonah arrived, a small box of tools clutched to his chest, and he told her he was going to fix the squeak in the screen door. She watched him work, her eyes catching the small twitches in his shoulders when he heard a distant car door slam, the way he flinched when a man's laughter echoed from the porch of his foster home. The laughter was harsh, too loud, followed by a cough and the creak of a rocking chair. They did not talk about it. They talked about the way the sunflowers in Mary's yard were beginning to droop under their own weight, about how the street had flooded briefly during the last rainstorm, about the cracked sidewalk Rebecca wished the city would fix because it made the getting down the block in her chair feel like crossing a battlefield of broken concrete. But beneath each word was the weight of that laughter, the bruises, the fear in Jonah's eyes. That evening, when the sky turned the soft color of peaches before dusk, Jonah lingered on the porch, the screen door now fixed, his hands busy winding and unwinding the handle of his screwdriver. Rebecca offered him iced tea, which he took, sitting on the top step beside her chair, their silence comfortable but taut, like the string of a violin just before it plays its note. "I like it here," he said finally, his voice so soft she almost missed it beneath the sound of a distant radio playing down the block. "I'm glad," she replied, setting her tea on the small table beside her, folding her hands in her lap to stop them from reaching for him. He was quiet again, staring at the darkening street. She saw the hesitation in the way he opened and closed his mouth, the way his fingers tightened around the glass, the way his foot tapped softly against the step. She wanted to reach out, to tell him he was safe here, but she knew trust could not be forced, that some truths had to be given in their own time, in their own fragile way. When he finally stood to leave, she saw him hesitate, turning back to look at her with eyes that were too old, too tired for a boy his age. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he was gone, his shadow slipping down the steps, down the walk, into the darkening street. That night, the rain came, heavy and warm, drumming against the roof in a constant, soothing rhythm. Rebecca lay in her bed, the sounds of the rain mixing with the memories of her own past, of nights when she had been the one who flinched at loud voices, who hid in shadows, who learned to shrink herself to stay invisible. She thought of the men who had seen her wheelchair as a weakness, who had pressed too close, who had touched without permission, who had whispered words that were meant to degrade and claim. She remembered how alone she had felt, how impossible it had seemed to escape. She did not want that for Jonah. She could see it in the way he avoided certain streets, the way he avoided the eyes of men who walked past him, the way he never stayed long near his foster home when the man was outside smoking on the porch, calling for Jonah in that voice that dripped with false kindness and something darker beneath. Days passed, the heat thickening, the air heavy with the promise of more storms. Jonah continued to come by, helping with small tasks, spending longer on the porch, sometimes pretending to fix things that did not need fixing. Rebecca let him, understanding that the porch had become a refuge for him, a place where he could breathe, where he could exist without fear, if only for a little while. One afternoon, as the sky darkened with the approach of a summer storm, Jonah arrived with a small basket of peaches, gifts from Mary, who had taken a liking to the boy and would send him over with small offerings. They sat on the porch, peeling the peaches with careful fingers, the juice running down their hands, sweet and sticky. They laughed when Jonah accidentally dropped a slice, and for a moment he looked like a child again, free and light, the weight lifted from his shoulders. But the laughter died quickly when a car pulled up in front of his foster home, and a man stepped out, slamming the door hard enough to make Jonah flinch, the peach slipping from his fingers. The man looked over, his eyes scanning the porch before landing on Jonah, and he called out, his voice sharp, demanding. Jonah's shoulders tightened, and the light in his eyes dimmed as he stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, glancing back at Rebecca with an apology in his eyes. "It's okay," she said softly, but he shook his head, turning away, stepping down the porch with quick, short steps, the basket forgotten on the step. Rebecca watched him go, the storm clouds rolling in, the wind picking up, rustling the leaves as the first drops of rain began to fall. She rolled to the edge of the porch, watching as Jonah walked toward the man, his head lowered, his shoulders hunched, the man's hand reaching out to grab him by the back of the neck, pulling him inside before the door slammed shut. The rain fell harder, washing the streets clean, but Rebecca felt the dirt of the world clinging to her skin, the helplessness pressing down on her as she sat on the porch, the basket of peaches between her feet, untouched. That night the storm raged, thunder shaking the windows, lightning flashing across the sky. Rebecca could not sleep. The image of Jonah's face as he turned back to her burned into her mind. She knew something was wrong, something deeper than bruises, something that had hollowed out the boy's laughter, that had replaced his light with fear. She spent the night praying, her hands clasped, her head bowed, asking for guidance, for the strength to help him, for the wisdom to know when to act, how to protect him, how to keep him safe in a world that saw him as disposable, as weak, as something to be used. Morning came, gray and heavy, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and hope that felt fragile, like the petals of the bruised flowers in the yard. Rebecca rolled to the window, looking out at the street, waiting for Jonah, praying that he would come, that he would find his way back to the porch, that he would let her help him, let her protect him in a way no one had protected her. And when she saw him, standing at the end of the street, his hair wet from the rain, his clothes clinging to his thin frame, she felt a quiet determination settle in her bones. She would not turn away. She would not fail him. Because sometimes God sent people into your life not just to be helped, but to give you a reason to keep fighting, to keep living, to keep believing that even in a world that tried to break you, there was still a purpose for your pain, still a reason to keep your heart soft and your spirit strong. As Jonah stepped onto the porch, his eyes lifting to meet hers, Rebecca knew the next chapter of her life had begun, that the shadows beneath the porch light were not enough to stop her from shining, from protecting, from being the person she needed when she was a child, when she was a young woman, when she was alone. And she would not let him be alone, not now, not ever. The morning after the storm, the air hung thick over Savannah, the streets still slick with the night's rain as clouds drifted low and heavy. The scent of wet soil and broken branches filtered through the window as Rebecca sat by it, her hands resting in her lap, eyes fixed on the sidewalk, waiting for Jonah. She had barely slept, her mind a restless wheel, turning over the way he had looked back at her as the man dragged him inside, the way his shoulders folded inward as if he was trying to disappear into himself. The sun rose, pale and filtered through clouds, bringing with it the sounds of sparrows in the hedges, the occasional car gliding over puddles, the creak of porch steps as neighbors started their day. When she finally saw him, Jonah was moving carefully, as if the world itself had become too sharp for him to touch. His walk was different, slower, each step measured, and though his hair was dry, there was a dullness to his skin, a tightness around his mouth as he carried a small box of tools in one hand. He approached the porch, eyes lowered, a small shadow of the boy who had once laughed as he dropped peach slices, who had once looked at her with a light that briefly touched the dark places inside him. He stopped at the bottom step, as if asking for permission to come closer, and Rebecca nodded once, slowly, rolling back to give him space. She noticed the way he moved, the slight stiffness in his arm as he adjusted the box, the wince he tried to hide when he bent to pick up a fallen screwdriver that clattered to the floor. He wore long sleeves despite the warmth, the fabric loose enough to shift and reveal glimpses of dark smudges along the inside of his wrists, the edges of purplish marks climbing up his forearms before disappearing beneath the cloth. Rebecca's heart clenched, her breath catching in her chest as she looked away, giving him the space to sit on the step, to take the small screwdriver in his trembling hands and pretend to fix the porch railing that had already been tightened twice before. She said nothing, only watching the way he blinked too often, the way his jaw clenched when a car door slammed in the distance, the way he flinched as if bracing for something that never came. They passed the morning in silence, interrupted only by the occasional chirp of birds or the rumble of a truck in the distance. Rebecca spoke softly about the basil that was finally taking root, about the stray cat that sometimes visited her porch at night, leaving paw prints on the dusty boards. Jonah listened, nodding now and then, his hands busy with the screwdriver, turning it over and over, tightening a screw that needed no tightening, loosening it again, as if the small, repetitive motions could hold back the fear that clung to him like the humidity in the air. She offered him iced tea, which he took with both hands, holding the glass carefully, watching the condensation drip onto his jeans. He didn't drink it immediately, only stared into the glass, as if the swirl of ice was more comforting than lifting it to his lips. When he finally did take a sip, he sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly, the tension leaving him for only a moment before returning with the sound of a door opening down the street. The man stood on the porch of Jonah's foster home, smoking, his gaze sweeping the street before settling on Jonah with a familiarity that made Rebecca's skin crawl. The man called out, his voice falsely cheerful, demanding, slicing through the quiet of the morning with an ease that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. Jonah flinched, spilling a drop of tea on his jeans, quickly setting the glass down before standing, eyes on the ground, mumbling something Rebecca could not hear. "Jonah," she said, her voice soft but firm, but he only shook his head, backing down the steps, the tools rattling in the box as he tried to steady himself. The man called again, this time sharper, and Jonah's back straightened as he turned and walked away, his steps quickening, his shoulders hunched, the box clutched tightly against his chest as he returned to the place that swallowed him whole each night. Rebecca watched him go, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress, the soft cotton bunching beneath her hands as she fought the urge to call after him, to demand he stay, to promise him safety she was not sure she could give. The man watched Jonah approach, a smirk on his face as he flicked the cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his boot before stepping aside to let Jonah pass, his hand briefly landing on Jonah's shoulder in a gesture that was too firm, too familiar, leaving Jonah to flinch again before disappearing inside. That night, Rebecca did not sleep. She sat in her chair by the window, the streetlight casting a pale glow on the pavement as moths fluttered and died against the glass. She prayed quietly and fervently for Jonah, for wisdom, for strength, for a sign of what to do, of how to reach him, how to help him without pushing him further into the shadows. Her memories clawed at her, pulling her back to nights when she too had felt that fear, that helplessness, when hands had touched her under the guise of care, when she had learned the silence that came with dependency and fear, when she had stopped fighting because the world taught her that some battles were not meant to be won. The days passed, slow and heavy, each one folding into the next as the heat settled over Savannah like a blanket that refused to lift. Jonah continued to come, less frequently now, sometimes with new bruises on his neck, sometimes with a limp he tried to hide as he bent to pick up fallen branches in her yard. Each visit was shorter, his words fewer, his laughter gone, replaced by silence and the constant glancing over his shoulder, the flinches at loud sounds, the way he hugged himself when he thought she was not looking. One afternoon, when the sky threatened rain again, he arrived without the box of tools, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched so far forward it looked as though he was trying to fold himself into nothingness. He did not step onto the porch immediately, standing at the bottom of the ramp, his eyes fixed on the ground, the tips of his shoes scuffing against the concrete as he shifted from foot to foot. "Jonah," Rebecca said softly, rolling forward until she was at the edge of the porch, the wheels of her chair pressing against the worn wood. He looked up, his eyes wide and glassy, and for a moment she saw the boy he had been, the boy who had smiled at her as he handed her a peach, the boy who had carefully carried a box of nails to fix her porch. But that light was fleeting, replaced by something darker, something that spoke of nights spent in fear, of hands that took without asking, of the bruises that were hidden beneath sleeves and the lies that followed to explain them away. "I can't stay long," he whispered, his voice so quiet she almost did not hear it over the breeze. "That's all right," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart was breaking with every word. He looked over his shoulder, back toward the house where the man stood on the porch, a bottle in his hand, watching, waiting. Jonah turned back, his lips trembling as if words wanted to come but could not find the shape to form. His hands twisted in the hem of his shirt, pulling the fabric until it stretched, until the seam strained, until Rebecca thought it might tear under the force of his fear. "You're safe here," she said, her voice soft but firm, the way she wished someone had spoken to her all those years ago. His eyes filled with tears, blinking quickly to keep them from falling, and he nodded once before turning away, walking back down the street, back towards the man who waited, back toward the house that was not a home. That night the rain returned, heavy and warm, pounding on the roof as Rebecca sat by the window, watching the water run in rivers down the street. She prayed again, prayed that Jonah would be safe, that he would find the strength to speak, that she would find the courage to act, to be the safety he needed when the world offered none. Days turned into weeks, the heat of summer thickening, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and the coming change. Jonah continued to come, but now there were days he would sit on the porch and say nothing at all, staring out at the street with hollow eyes, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. There were moments when he would flinch at her touch, pulling away before she could comfort him, moments when he would look at her with such longing, such desperation, that it broke something inside her each time. She began to notice other things, the way he avoided looking at her when she asked about his day, the way he tensed when she mentioned the man, the way he always positioned himself between her and the street, as if afraid of being seen, as if afraid of being dragged back to that place by a voice calling his name. The bruises were no longer just on his wrists, but sometimes on his neck, his collarbone, the edges of dark marks that spoke of rough hands and nights spent trying to remain silent, of struggles that left their stories on his skin. One afternoon, as the cicadas screamed their summer song, Jonah sat beside her, his head lowered, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She did not touch him, only waited, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the sky as clouds drifted by. When he finally spoke, his voice was so small, so broken, that it barely reached her ears. "It hurts," he whispered, and then fell silent again. She did not ask what, did not press him for details, only nodded, her own tears falling quietly as she whispered back, "I know." Because she did. She knew the hurt of bruises that were not spoken of, the hurt of hands that took without permission, the hurt of silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. She knew what it was to be trapped, to feel your body betray you, to learn to shrink yourself to survive, and she knew that the time was coming when she would have to act, to protect him in the way she had needed protection, to break the silence that held him captive, to show him that love did not have to hurt, that safety was not a lie, that his life did not have to be lived in fear. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Rebecca made herself a promise. She would not let Jonah be alone in his fear, would not let the bruises remain unspoken, would not let the man who hurt him continue to take and take until there was nothing left of the boy who had once laughed on her porch. She would find a way to save him, even if it meant tearing open wounds she had tried to let heal, even if it meant facing the darkness she had spent years trying to leave behind. Because Jonah was worth it. Because every child was worth it. Because she could not stand by and watch another life be broken by the silence of fear. And so she prayed, quietly and fiercely, that when the time came, she would be ready. The morning was soft, sunlight filtering through the curtains and strips of gold that fell across Rebecca's lap as she sat in her chair by the window, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands as the cicadas hummed in the distance. The world outside moved slowly, the leaves rustling in the mild breeze that swept through the porch, lifting the edges of the newspaper that lay folded on the small table beside her. Her thoughts were heavy, shifting with every shadow that passed across the street, each sound of footsteps making her breath catch as she waited for Jonah's small figure to appear. When he did, it was without the hesitant pauses that had marked his steps in the past weeks. His head was lowered, his thin shoulders hunched beneath the too large shirt, and he moved quickly, as if afraid that any delay would give the world time to reach out and grab him back. The air seemed to hold its breath as he approached, the sun hidden behind a drifting cloud, the light dimming just enough to turn the morning gray. He stopped at the edge of the porch, clutching a brown paper bag in his hand, his fingers curling and uncurling around the thin handle as he lifted his eyes to meet hers. The look in them was different today, something fragile but determined, the way a branch bends under the weight of rain but does not break. She saw the faint swelling along his jaw, the purplish bruise that disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt, and she felt the familiar rage rise in her, the kind that sat heavy in her chest, pressing against her ribs until it hurt to breathe. "Come sit, Jonah," she said softly, her voice steady even as her fingers trembled around the cup. He nodded, stepping onto the porch with cautious movements, each step measured, as if the boards might splinter beneath him. He sat on the step, the paper bag crinkling in his hands, his eyes on the porch floor as he traced the worn patterns in the wood with the tip of his shoe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only with the sound of birds calling to each other from the branches, the distant rumble of a truck passing down the road, the soft creak of the porch boards beneath Rebecca's chair as she shifted, trying to ease the tension that had settled into her spine. "What did you bring today?" she asked gently, nodding towards the bag he clutched so tightly. He looked at it as if he had forgotten it was there, his fingers loosening their grip as he set it down beside him, pushing it toward her with a small nudge. "Peaches," he whispered, his voice rough, the word catching in his throat before it was fully formed. She reached down to take the bag, the weight of it light in her hands, the scent of the fruit rising to meet her as she opened it, the sweet, familiar aroma filling the space between them. She pulled one out, its skin soft and warm from the sun, and held it for a moment, remembering the last summer when Jonah had brought her peaches, the way he had smiled as he handed them to her, the way he had laughed when juice had dripped down his wrist, the sunlight catching in his hair as he wiped it away with the back of his hand. "Thank you," she said, placing the peach on the table beside her, her eyes meeting his as she offered him a small, gentle smile. He nodded, his eyes darting away, his hands folding in his lap as he took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he struggled with words that seemed too heavy to lift. The silence grew, stretching out between them, filling the porch with the weight of all the things they could not say. Rebecca waited, letting the quiet settle around them, her eyes soft as she watched him, giving him the space he needed, the space she had once needed herself. She could see the tremble in his fingers, the way his jaw tightened as he blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She remembered that feeling, the way it clawed at the inside of your chest, the way it made your skin feel too tight, your body too small to contain the fear and the shame and the desperate need to be heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, the words tumbling out in a rush before he could stop them. "It hurts," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor, his fingers twisting together until his knuckles turned white. "It hurts when he drinks, when he's mad, when he says it's my fault, when he says I should be grateful, when he—" His voice broke and he pressed his hands to his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Rebecca's heart cracked, the sound of it loud in her ears as she reached out, letting her hand rest gently on his knee, grounding him, letting him know she was there, that he was not alone. She did not speak, did not interrupt, letting him cry, letting the pain find its way out of him in the only way it could, through the tears that fell onto the porch boards, darkening the wood beneath him. When he finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, she saw the fear there, the shame, the desperate need for comfort, for safety, for someone to tell him that it was not his fault, that he was not the cause of the bruises on his body, that he was not to blame for the hurt that had been forced upon him. "Jonah," she said softly, her voice steady, her hand warm on his knee, "it's not your fault." He shook his head, the tears falling again as he whispered, "He says it is. He says I deserve it, that I make him angry, that I don't do things right, that if I just listened, if I was better—" "No," she said, firmer now, leaning forward so he could see the truth in her eyes. "You don't deserve this." None of it is your fault." He looked at her, his lips trembling as he struggled to believe her, to let the words sink into the places inside him that had been carved out by fear and pain. She held his gaze, letting him see the strength there, the certainty, the promise that he was not alone, that she would not let him carry this burden by himself. The day passed slowly, the sun moving across the sky as they sat on the porch, the sounds of the neighborhood drifting around them, the world moving on even as their small world on the porch stood still. She spoke to him softly, telling him stories of her own childhood, of the pain she had endured, the lessons she had learned, the strength she had found in the darkest of places. She did not give him false promises, did not tell him it would be easy, but she told him the truth, that healing was possible, that safety was possible, that he deserved both. Jonah listened, his eyes on her, his hands slowly relaxing in his lap as the words found their way into the spaces where hope had once lived, planting seeds that might one day grow into something stronger, something that could carry him through the nights when the darkness seemed too heavy to bear. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, he stood, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt, his shoulders straighter than they had been that morning, his eyes clearer, though still shadowed by fear. He looked at her, his lips parting as if to speak, but the words caught in his throat, and he shook his head, turning to leave, pausing at the edge of the porch. "Jonah," she called softly, and he turned back, his eyes meeting hers as the last light of the day caught in them, reflecting the pain and the hope, the fear and the strength that lived side by side within him. "You're not alone," she said, and he nodded once before turning and walking down the street, the shadows lengthening around him as he moved back toward the place that was not a home, back toward the man who waited for him, back toward the fear he could not yet escape. That night, Rebecca sat by the window, watching the stars as they blinked into existence, the darkness pressing against the glass as she prayed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her whispers soft but firm as she asked for strength, for courage, for the wisdom to know how to help him, how to protect him, how to give him the safety she had once needed so desperately. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that the bruises he carried were more than just the marks on his skin, that they were whispers in the dark, reminders of fear that would not easily fade. But she also knew that he had taken the first step, that he had spoken the truth, that he had allowed himself to be seen, to be heard, to be comforted even, if just for a moment. And that was the beginning. As she turned from the window, rolling back to her bed, she let the tears come, the quiet sobs that shook her shoulders as she wept for the boy who had brought her peaches, for the boy who had whispered his pain, for the boy who deserved so much more than the world had given him. In the darkness, she made a promise, to herself and to him, that she would not let him face this alone, that she would not let the whispers of bruises be the only story he would carry, that she would find a way to give him a life that was more than fear and pain and silence, because Jonah deserved to be free, because Jonah deserved to be loved, because Jonah deserved to be safe. And she would find a way to make sure he knew that every day until the fear faded and the bruises healed, until the whispers became nothing more than echoes of a past that no longer had power over him. The dawn light was pale when Rebecca woke, her eyes blinking open to the soft gray of early morning pressing against the curtains. She lay still for a moment, listening to the creaks of the old house settling around her, the distant hum of a delivery truck groaning down the street, the cautious chirping of birds in the hedge outside. Her body was heavy with yesterday's tears, the weight of Jonah's whispered truth still pressing against her chest as she turned her head on the pillow, staring at the ceiling where the patterns of cracked paint traced the years she had spent in this house. She remembered the look on his face as he left her porch, the desperate way he had tried to stand tall even as the fear never left his eyes. She knew that look. She had lived with it for years, the feeling of carrying an entire world on shoulders that were too small, the sharp edge of loneliness that crept into your bones even when you told yourself you were strong enough to carry it alone. She pushed herself up with a quiet grunt, shifting her legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold floor against her bare feet before reaching for the chair beside her. She moved with practiced ease, sliding herself onto the seat, gripping the wheels as she took a deep breath, letting the morning settle into her lungs as she turned toward the window. The sky was streaked with the softest pink, a promise that today would be clear, the kind of day where the breeze was gentle and the air smelled of warm earth and leaves. She let herself hold on to that promise just for a moment before turning toward the kitchen, the quiet of the house broken only by the soft clicks of her wheels on the floorboards. The kettle hissed softly as it heated, the rising steam catching in the cold air as she prepared her tea, the scent of chamomile filling the small kitchen as she waited, her eyes on the small garden outside the window where the herbs she had planted swayed in the breeze. She focused on them, on the small signs of life that continued to grow, even in the shadow of everything she had endured, even in the heavy silence that often settled over her when the memories came too close. She reminded herself that growing things was a promise too, that every green leaf was proof that even the hardest winters could end, that something could always grow again. As she sipped her tea, she let her mind return to Jonah, to the boy with the too big shirt and the bruises that whispered stories he was too afraid to tell. She remembered the way his hands had trembled, the way his eyes had darted to the ground as if the shame would swallow him whole if he dared to meet her gaze. She remembered the way her own hands had trembled too, the way she had once hidden her bruises beneath long sleeves, the way she had told herself it was better to stay silent because the world had no place for the truth of what people could do to each other behind closed doors. That morning, she decided she would not let him disappear into that silence again. She spent the day moving through her routine with quiet focus, tending to her herbs, checking the small bottles of tinctures and salves that lined the shelves in her shop, answering the questions of the few early customers who came seeking remedies for sleepless nights and aching joints. She greeted each of them with the same gentle smile, the same soft voice that reassured them they were seen, they were heard, even if only in the small transactions of herbs and healing. But in the back of her mind, she was waiting, listening for the sound of footsteps on the porch, for the hesitant knock that would announce his arrival. He came in the late afternoon when the shadows were beginning to stretch across the yard, when the air had turned warm and heavy, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and summer dust. She saw him through the window before he reached the porch, the way he moved slowly, carefully, his eyes scanning the street as if afraid that every passing car might carry someone who would drag him back to the place he feared. His hands were empty today. No paper bag with peaches, no excuse to offer for why he had come. Just himself, his thin arms hanging at his sides, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of something he could no longer carry alone. She opened the door before he could knock, letting him see her there, letting him know he was welcome, that he did not have to ask to be allowed in. He looked at her for a moment, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came, only a breath that caught in his chest before he stepped inside, the screen door creaking shut behind him. They sat in the kitchen, the late sunlight falling across the table in slanted lines, catching in the glass jar of mint leaves she had been sorting before he arrived. He stared at them at the way the light made the green glow, his fingers reaching out to touch one of the leaves before pulling back quickly, as if even that small act of reaching out was too much. "Would you like some tea?" she asked quietly, her hands already moving to prepare another cup. He nodded, swallowing hard as he kept his eyes on the table, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm against the wood. She moved around the kitchen with practiced movements, the kettle humming as it reheated, the scent of mint joining the chamomile that still lingered in the air. When she placed the cup in front of him, he looked up briefly, meeting her eyes for just a moment, before dropping his gaze again. They sat in silence, the steam rising between them, the quiet stretching out as the house settled around them, the soft creaks of wood and the distant sounds of the neighborhood moving past them like a slow river. She waited, letting him find his words, letting him know that he was not expected to fill the silence with explanations he was not ready to give. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, as if it belonged to someone much younger than the boy sitting in front of her. "It's getting worse," he said, his fingers tightening around the cup, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. He drinks more now, and when he does, he paused, his throat working as he swallowed, his eyes closing for a moment as he took a shuddering breath. He says things, does things, says it's my fault, that I owe him. Rebecca felt her hands tighten on the arms of her chair, her nails pressing into the wood as she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her breathing steady as she listened. She could see the way his shoulders shook, the way his breath came in sharp, quick gasps as he struggled to hold back the fear that threatened to spill over. "He says, if I tell anyone, no one will believe me," Jonah whispered, his eyes still closed, the tears slipping down his cheek silently. "He says no one will care, that I'm just a burden." She reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his, letting him feel the warmth there, the steady presence that she offered without words. He flinched at first, but then he let out a breath, his shoulders sagging as he let himself feel the comfort, the safety that she was offering. "You are not a burden," she said softly, her voice firm, steady, the words carrying the weight of truth that she hoped would settle into the places inside him that had been carved out by fear and shame. "You are not alone. You don't deserve what's happening to you." He looked up then, his eyes red and swollen, the tears still falling as he searched her face for something, for the reassurance that he was not imagining the kindness she was offering, that he was not wrong to hope for help, for safety. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice breaking as he finally let himself say the words that had been trapped inside him for so long. "I don't know how to make it stop." She squeezed his hand gently, letting him feel the strength in her grip, the promise that she would not let him face this alone. "We will figure it out together," she said, the words simple but true, a promise that she would keep, no matter how difficult the path ahead would be. The afternoon light began to fade, the kitchen growing dim as the shadows lengthened, but they did not move, did not break the fragile sanctuary they had created around the small kitchen table. They spoke in quiet voices, sharing pieces of themselves that had been hidden for too long, letting the truth settle between them like soft rain, washing away the silence that had once held them prisoner. Jonah left that evening with a promise that he could come back, that he could call her if he needed to, that he did not have to go through another night alone with the fear. She watched him walk down the street, his steps slow but steadier than they had been when he arrived, the street lights casting long shadows across the pavement as he disappeared into the gathering darkness. Rebecca closed the door quietly, leaning her forehead against the cool wood as she let out a breath she had been holding all day. She felt the weight of his pain, the sharp edge of fear that came with knowing how fragile his safety was, how easily the promise of sanctuary could be shattered by the cruelty of the world. But she also felt the small flame of hope that had begun to grow, the quiet strength that came from knowing that he had trusted her, that he had chosen to let her help him, that he had allowed himself to be seen. That night, as she lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, she let herself believe that they could find a way forward, that they could build something stronger than the fear that had held them captive for so long. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer into the darkness, a promise that she would not let him face this alone, that she would protect him, guide him, help him find a way to heal. And as sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of the garden outside, of the small green leaves reaching for the sun, of the promise that no matter how dark the world became, something could always grow again. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm that disguised the storm building beneath the surface. Rebecca continued to tend to her herb shop, the jars of dried leaves and carefully labeled bottles lining the shelves like sentinels watching over her small sanctuary. The comforting scent of lavender and rosemary often mingled with the morning air as she worked, her hands moving automatically, measuring and grinding, pouring and stirring, her mind only partially on the tasks in front of her. The other part of her was always listening, waiting, carrying the weight of Jonah's trembling voice, the way he had looked at her when he finally allowed the truth to slip out, the desperation in his eyes as he admitted what was happening in the home he was forced to return to each night. Jonah came by often, sometimes under the guise of helping her restock jars or sweeping the floor, other times simply standing in the doorway until she invited him inside, offering him tea and a quiet place to sit while the shadows under his eyes seemed to darken day by day. He tried to smile, tried to be helpful, tried to hide the shaking in his hands when he reached for a cup or passed her a jar, but Rebecca saw the signs that others would miss. She saw the way his gaze darted to the window at any loud sound outside, the way he flinched when someone walked too close behind him, the way he unconsciously rubbed his wrist as though remembering a grip too tight to escape. One Thursday, the morning was cool, and the air smelled of coming rain as Jonah arrived early, his shoulders tense, eyes hollow, as he stepped inside without speaking. Rebecca simply set down her basket of chamomile and opened her arms, and without hesitation, Jonah stepped into the embrace, burying his face in her shoulder as he let out a sound that was neither a sob nor a sigh, but something in between, something broken that made her tighten her arms around him. She felt the thinness of him, the trembling that he could not hide, and as he pulled away she saw the small bruise near his hairline, half hidden by the tangled curls he had tried to comb forward. She said nothing, only guided him to the chair by the window, letting the gray light fall over him as he slumped into the seat, staring at his hands. They sat in silence for a while, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood and the chirping of birds trying to outlast the oncoming drizzle filling the space between them. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed with red, the tears not yet fallen but heavy, threatening to spill with each breath. "I can't go back," he whispered, the words so soft they were almost lost in the patter of the first drops of rain against the glass. "I can't do it anymore." Rebecca placed a gentle hand over his, grounding him, steadying him, as she leaned forward to meet his gaze. "Tell me what happened." His lips trembled, and he clenched his jaw, forcing the words out in pieces as though they might choke him on the way up. "He came into my room again last night. He was drunk, so drunk I could smell it before he even opened the door. He was angry about something, I don't even know what, and he said I needed to learn respect, that I owed him for everything he's done for me. He hit me, and then he tried to—" His voice cracked and the tears fell, hot and fast, dripping onto the backs of his hands. "I fought him off, but he said next time I wouldn't be able to stop him, that no one would believe me anyway, that I should be grateful he even lets me live there." Rebecca felt her own breath catch, anger rising in her chest like a living thing, but she kept her voice calm as she squeezed his hand. "You're not going back," she said quietly, firmly, with the kind of certainty that could anchor a drowning child. "You will not go back there, Jonah." He shook his head, wiping his tears with the back of his sleeve, leaving a smear of salt across his cheek. "Where would I go? The system will just send me back, or worse, to another home where it might be the same. No one wants to take in a kid my age, especially a black kid, especially one who's already been in the system. They'll say I'm lying, that I'm trying to cause trouble so I can run away." She could see how deeply he believed those words, how the fear in his eyes was more than just the fear of physical harm, but the fear of becoming invisible again, of becoming another file in a system that never saw the children behind the paperwork. She reached up, gently tilting his chin so he had to meet her eyes. "You are not trouble. You are not a burden. You deserve to be safe, and I will not let you go back there." Her voice did not shake, and as she spoke she felt something within her settle, a quiet promise to herself that no matter the cost she would protect him. The rain had begun to fall harder now, drumming softly against the roof, and for a moment they just sat there, letting the sound wash over them, letting the moment breathe. Then Rebecca stood, moving to the counter to grab her phone, dialing a number she had memorized long ago but had not used in years. Her fingers were steady, but her heart pounded as she listened to the ringing, each tone a reminder that what she was about to do would change everything. When the voice on the other end answered, warm but professional, she cleared her throat. "Hello, this is Rebecca Price. I need to report abuse. The boy is here with me, and he can't go back." The conversation was brief, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion. She turned back to Jonah, who was watching her with wide eyes, fear and hope warring in the depths of his gaze. "What's going to happen now?" he asked, his voice small, the vulnerability in it twisting something deep inside her. "They're going to send someone to talk to you," she explained gently, moving to kneel beside his chair, ignoring the stiffness in her knees. "We're going to tell them the truth, and we're going to make sure you're safe. You don't have to face him again, not alone." The hours that followed were tense, each minute dragging as they waited for the social worker to arrive. Jonah paced, restless, flinching at every sound outside, every car that passed, every knock from the wind against the window. Rebecca stayed close, talking to him in low, soothing tones, reminding him to breathe, reminding him that he was safe here, that she would not let him be taken back to that house. She prepared tea neither of them drank, the cups growing cold on the table as they waited. When the knock finally came, Jonah froze, his eyes darting to the door as he stepped back, his shoulders hunching as if preparing for a blow. Rebecca moved first, opening the door to a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, her voice calm as she introduced herself, stepping inside with careful movements that spoke of experience with fragile situations. They sat together in the living room, Jonah pressed against the arm of the couch, Rebecca beside him, her hand resting over his as he told the story, halting and broken, but clear enough that the truth was unmistakable. The social worker listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, taking notes, her face never showing the horror that must have echoed in her mind with each detail Jonah shared. When he was finished, he looked down, exhausted, his hands shaking as he tried to wipe away the tears that kept falling. The social worker reached out, placing a gentle hand on his knee. "You are very brave for telling me this," she said softly. "You did the right thing." They discussed options, the legal steps that would be taken, the temporary placements available, the process of finding a permanent safe environment. Each word was another weight lifted from Jonah's shoulders, but also another reminder of how fragile the future still was, how easily it could be swept away if they were not careful. As the social worker prepared to leave, she turned to Rebecca. "You've done a good thing here," she said quietly. "Not everyone would have opened their door." Rebecca only nodded, her eyes on Jonah, who was looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and fear, as though afraid that once the door closed, everything would disappear. "You'll stay here tonight," she told him once the door closed, locking it with a quiet click that sounded like a promise. "You're safe here." That night, Rebecca prepared the guest room, making up the bed with fresh sheets that smelled of lavender, placing a small lamp by the bedside so he would not have to sleep in darkness. She found one of her old sweatshirts for him to wear, the fabric soft and warm as he changed into it, his thin frame almost lost in the folds, but the small smile he gave her as he sat on the edge of the bed was enough to ease the ache in her chest. As she turned to leave, he called out softly, "Rebecca?" She turned, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything he could not say. She nodded, her hand resting on the doorframe as she replied, "You are worth protecting, Jonah. Remember that." She closed the door softly, leaving it open just a crack, enough that he would know she was there if he needed her. As she moved down the hallway, the weight of the day settled into her bones, but it was a weight she bore willingly, a weight that came with the knowledge that she had kept her promise. In the quiet of her room, as she lay in bed, listening to the rain still falling outside, she felt a peace she had not felt in years. She had opened her door, her heart, and in doing so, she had given Jonah a chance at freedom, at safety, at healing. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that the scars would take time to fade, that the system was imperfect and the world was often cruel. But she also knew that together they had taken the first step. And as she drifted into sleep, the storm outside easing into a gentle patter, Rebecca allowed herself to believe that perhaps, despite everything, there was still hope, and that even in the darkest moments, the promise of light could still find its way in. The morning came softly, with pale light slipping through the curtains and spreading across the wooden floor, carrying with it a sense of quiet promise. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the world washed clean, the leaves outside glistening with drops that caught the sunlight as it returned to Savannah. Rebecca lay awake for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, broken only by the occasional creak of the old beams and the distant hum of early traffic. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, charged with the knowledge that change had arrived and would not be turned away. She rose slowly, her body still heavy with the weight of all that had happened. Yet there was a lightness too, a sense of a burden shifting from her shoulders as she moved. She dressed in the soft cotton dress she wore on market days, tied her hair back, and moved quietly down the hallway, pausing outside the guest room where Jonah now slept. The door was still ajar, as she had left it, and she could hear his breathing, deep and steady in the early morning calm. For a moment, she allowed herself to stand there, hand resting on the frame, remembering the look on his face the night before when she told him he would stay, that he was safe here, that he did not have to return to the place that had stolen so much from him. The memories of that conversation lingered as she turned toward the kitchen, beginning her morning routine with careful precision. The kettle on the stove, the measured scoop of coffee grounds, the slow stirring of oatmeal as it bubbled softly, releasing a comforting warmth into the air. She set 2 bowls on the table, 2 cups, 2 spoons, the simple act of preparation ground in her as she moved through the motions of care. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and she found herself humming softly, a tune her mother used to hum, one that carried the comfort of long-forgotten days when life was simpler, before the world had shown its cruelty, before she had learned how fragile safety could be. Jonah emerged quietly, his presence in the doorway hesitant, as though he was unsure of his place in this morning ritual. His hair was tousled from sleep, his eyes still soft with the weight of dreams, and he wore the sweatshirt she had given him, the sleeves pushed up past his thin wrists. For a moment their eyes met, and in that look was a fragile understanding, a silent agreement that they would navigate this day together, that this moment was theirs to claim. "Good morning," Rebecca said softly, gesturing toward the table. Jonah nodded, a small smile pulling at the corners of his mouth as he stepped forward, taking a seat, his eyes flickering over the bowls, the steam rising gently in the morning light. He picked up the spoon slowly, as though testing its weight, and took a careful bite, chewing with deliberate focus. Rebecca watched him, her own bowl untouched for a moment, and she saw the way his shoulders seemed to ease with each bite, the way his eyes softened as the warmth of the food worked its quiet magic. They ate in silence, the clink of the spoons against the bowls the only sound between them, and it was enough. It was a silence that spoke of trust, of tentative beginnings, of the possibility that they could build something new from the pieces of their broken histories. After breakfast, Rebecca set about her work in the herb shop, the small bell above the door jingling occasionally as customers came and went, the familiar faces of neighbors and those who came for her remedies, each leaving with small paper bags filled with carefully measured herbs and whispered instructions for teas and tinctures. Jonah helped where he could, sweeping the floor, organizing the jars, his movements cautious but willing, each small act a step toward reclaiming a sense of purpose. When the social worker returned later that morning, Jonah froze, the broom still in his hands as he looked toward the door, his eyes wide with the memory of too many meetings that ended in fear and disappointment. But Rebecca moved to his side, her hand resting on his shoulder, grounding him as they faced the woman together. The conversation was gentle, the social worker explaining the steps that would follow, the investigations that would continue, the temporary arrangements that would need to be made. Jonah listened, his eyes flickering toward Rebecca occasionally, seeking reassurance, finding it each time in the calm strength of her gaze. "You have options," the social worker explained. "You're not going back there. We will find a place where you will be safe, where you will be treated with the care and respect you deserve." Jonah nodded slowly, the words sinking in, the fear in his eyes softening into cautious hope. Rebecca squeezed his shoulder gently, reminding him that he was not alone, that he would not be abandoned to the system that had failed him before. When the social worker left, Jonah stood in the quiet of the shop, his eyes downcast, the broom still in his hands. Rebecca stepped closer, turning him gently so he would look at her. "You did well," she said softly. "You are brave, Jonah." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening, and for a moment he simply nodded, the words caught in his throat, too heavy to speak. The days that followed were filled with small, quiet moments of healing. Jonah began to laugh again, small chuckles that would escape as he recounted a memory from school, or when Rebecca showed him how to prepare a tea blend, his hands learning the careful motions of crushing the leaves, the scent of mint and lemon balm filling the air. He began to help customers, his voice shy but kind as he explained the uses of the herbs, the uncertainty in his gaze slowly being replaced by a quiet confidence. In the evenings, they would sit together on the small porch, the air warm with the scent of the earth cooling after the sun, the crickets singing in the darkness. Rebecca would sip her tea, Jonah beside her, his legs tucked beneath him as he watched the stars blink to life in the sky above. They would talk softly, about the herbs, about the day, about the small victories he found in learning to trust again. Sometimes he would fall silent, his eyes distant, the shadows of the past pulling at the edges of his peace, and Rebecca would let the silence sit between them until he was ready, until he turned to her and spoke of the fear that still lived in him, of the nightmares that woke him in the dark, of the way the past sometimes felt like it was still chasing him, and each time she would remind him, softly, firmly, that he was safe now, that he was free to build a new life, that the past did not define the future he deserved to have. The social worker returned with updates, explaining that the investigation was progressing, that his abuser would face charges, that there were options for Jonah to stay with a foster family that was experienced with teenagers, with children who had suffered, who would understand the care he needed. Jonah listened, his eyes on Rebecca, fear and hope warring in his gaze. When the day came for him to meet the foster family, he stood at the door of the shop, his backpack slung over his shoulder, the small collection of clothes and books he had gathered during his time with Rebecca packed carefully inside. He turned to her, his eyes glistening, his lower lip trembling as he tried to speak. "You will be okay," she told him, stepping forward, pulling him into a gentle hug, feeling the way he clung to her, the way he buried his face in her shoulder, the way his body shook with the weight of goodbye. "You're not alone anymore, Jonah," she whispered. "You are loved. You are worth loving. Never forget that." When he pulled away, he nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand, his smile small but real. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying all the weight of the gratitude he could not fully express. As he left with the social worker, Rebecca stood in the doorway, watching him go, the sunlight falling across the path as he turned once to wave, his eyes bright with the promise of something new, something safe, something he could call his own. The shop felt quieter after he was gone, the absence of his presence like a soft echo in the corners of the room. But as Rebecca moved through the space, tending to the jars, sweeping the floor, preparing the teas, she felt a sense of peace settling over her, the knowledge that she had done what was right, that she had opened her door and her heart, and in doing so, had helped to give a child a new beginning. The days turned to weeks. The herbs grew in the small garden behind the shop. The customers continued to come, seeking the comfort of her remedies, the warmth of her quiet wisdom. Rebecca, continued to write letters to Jonah, sending him small notes of encouragement, reminders that he was not forgotten, that he was loved, that he was strong. And in the quiet moments, as she sipped her tea in the soft light of dawn, she allowed herself to hope, to believe that even in a world so often marked by cruelty and pain, there was still room for kindness, for healing, for the building of a new life from the ashes of the old. She was, after all, a woman who had learned that the truest strength was not in what the world saw on the outside, but in the quiet and persistent choice to keep going, to keep loving, to keep fighting for what was right, even when it was hard. And as the sun rose each day, spreading light over Savannah, Rebecca knew that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Jonah, but for herself as well. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that inspire and challenge us. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and check out the next videos on the screen to discover more stories of strength and survival. Thank you for being here with us.